My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm 26 years old. What started as a simple mistake of forgetting my presentation folder at home turned into the moment that shattered everything I believed about my family. Standing frozen outside my childhood home, listening to my parents discuss how they'd been lying to me my entire life about who I really was, I realized that sometimes, the people you trust most are the ones capable of the deepest betrayal. The conversation I overheard that Tuesday morning didn't just change my perspective, it ignited a fire for justice that would ultimately expose decades of family deception and force everyone to face the consequences of their choices. Before we dive into this wild family revenge story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and if you're ready for a tale of shocking family secrets and sweet justice, smash that like button and subscribe for more jaw-dropping true stories. Trust me, you won't believe how this unfolds. It was a typical Tuesday morning in downtown Seattle when I realized I'd left my most important presentation folder on my kitchen counter. As a marketing coordinator for a tech startup, this wasn't just any folder, it contained 3 months of research for our biggest client pitch. My boss had already made it clear that this presentation could make or break my chances for the promotion I'd been working toward since joining the company 18 months ago. I lived about 15 minutes from my parents' house in the Ballard neighborhood, where I'd grown up. Since I had 45 minutes before the meeting, I figured I could swing by, grab the folder, and still make it back to downtown with time to spare. Mom usually left for her job at the hospital by 7:30, and Dad would be in his home office doing his freelance accounting work, so I didn't expect to see either of them. Using my spare key, I quietly entered through the back door, hoping to avoid any lengthy conversations about why I looked stressed or why I was rushing around. The house felt exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood, the same floral wallpaper in the kitchen, the same family photos lining the hallway, the same comforting smell of Mom's vanilla candles. These were the walls that had witnessed my first steps, my high school graduation photos, and countless family dinners where we'd laughed and shared stories about our days. As I grabbed my folder from the counter, I heard voices coming from the living room. Dad's voice carried that serious tone he only used when discussing something important, and Mom's responses sounded unusually tense. Curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself moving closer to the doorway, staying just out of sight behind the wall that separated the kitchen from the living room. "We can't keep this from her forever, Margaret," Dad was saying, his voice heavy with what sounded like years of burden. "She's 26 now, and she deserves to know the truth about what happened with Linda." My heart stopped. Linda was my aunt, my mom's younger sister who had died in a car accident when I was 3 years old. I had only vague memories of her, mostly from family photos and the stories my parents occasionally shared about how much she had loved me as a baby. "Robert, we've been over this 100 times," Mom replied, and I could hear the strain in her voice. Sarah was too young to understand what really happened, and now too much time has passed. It would destroy her to learn the truth about Linda, and it would destroy our family. "But Margaret, every time Sarah mentions wanting to have children someday, or talks about wondering if she'll be a good mother, I feel sick keeping this secret. She has the right to know that Linda didn't die in a car accident. She has the right to know that Linda was her real mother." The folder slipped from my hands and hit the kitchen floor with a soft thud. I pressed my back against the wall, feeling like someone had just punched me in the stomach and knocked all the air from my lungs. Linda wasn't my aunt, who died tragically young, she was my mother. The woman I'd called Mom for 26 years wasn't actually my biological mother. What was that noise? Mom's voice carried from the living room, sharp with sudden alertness. I quickly bent down to pick up my scattered papers, my hands shaking so badly I could barely gather them together. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just heard while simultaneously planning how to get out of the house without being discovered. "Probably just the cat," Dad replied, though I could hear him getting up from his chair. We didn't have a cat. I managed to stuff the papers back into my folder and was heading toward the back door when I heard Mom's voice again, now closer to the kitchen. "We can never tell her the real story, Robert. Sarah can never know that Linda was her biological mother, and she absolutely cannot know that Linda didn't die in an accident. If she ever found out that Linda died because of the choice we made, because we convinced her to give up her parental rights, and then she spiraled into depression and addiction afterward, it would destroy everything. Sarah would never forgive us for lying to her about who she really is, and she'd never forgive us for what happened to Linda." I felt like I was going to throw up. Not only was Linda my real mother, but my parents had somehow been involved in her death. The car accident story was completely fabricated. I managed to slip out the back door just as I heard footsteps approaching the kitchen, and I practically ran to my car, my presentation folder clutched against my chest like a shield. Driving back to work, my hands were still trembling on the steering wheel. Everything I thought I knew about my identity, my family, my history, it was all a lie. The woman who raised me wasn't my biological mother. And my real mother hadn't died in a tragic accident, as I'd been told my entire life. According to what I'd overheard, Linda had died because of something my parents had done, something that had caused her to spiral into depression and addiction. The presentation that morning was a complete disaster. I stumbled through my carefully prepared slides, forgetting key points and mixing up statistics. My boss, Jennifer, pulled me aside afterward with a concerned expression that made my stomach drop even further. "Sarah, that wasn't like you at all," she said, studying my face carefully. "Is everything okay? You seem distracted and completely off your game." I mumbled something about not feeling well and promised to do better on the follow-up meeting scheduled for Friday. Jennifer nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. The promotion I'd been working toward suddenly felt insignificant compared to the earth-shattering revelation about my family. For the rest of the week, I moved through my daily routine like a zombie. I couldn't concentrate at work, couldn't enjoy my usual evening runs around Green Lake, and definitely couldn't bring myself to call my parents for our typical Sunday phone check-in. Every time I looked in the mirror, I found myself searching for resemblances to the woman I'd called Mom my entire life, now wondering if any of our supposed similarities were real or just wishful thinking. By Friday, I knew I had to take action. I couldn't continue living with this knowledge burning inside me without understanding the full truth. I started with the most obvious step: researching Linda's death online. I searched through old Seattle Times archives, looking for any mention of Linda Morrison, my mother's maiden name, and any car accident reports from 23 years ago. What I found made my blood run cold. There was no record of Linda Morrison dying in a car accident. However, I did find a brief obituary that painted a completely different picture. Linda Morrison had died at age 28 from a drug overdose, leaving behind family members who will remember her kind heart and gentle spirit. The obituary was published exactly 3 years after my birth date. I spent hours digging deeper into public records, using every free genealogy website and records database I could find. What emerged was a trail of documents that told a story my parents had never shared. Linda had been unmarried when she gave birth to me, listing no father on the birth certificate. 6 months later, there were legal documents showing that she had voluntarily terminated her parental rights, with Robert and Margaret Mitchell listed as the adoptive parents. The timeline was starting to make sense, but it raised even more questions. Why would Linda give up her baby to her own sister? What had convinced her to make such a dramatic decision? And most importantly, what role had my adoptive parents played in the depression and addiction that ultimately led to her death? I knew I needed more information than public records could provide, so I decided to reach out to people who might have known Linda during that time. I started with my mom's old high school friends, people I remembered from various family gatherings over the years. I crafted careful messages on Facebook, explaining that I was putting together a memory book for my Aunt Linda and would love to hear any stories they might be willing to share. The responses I received were eye-opening. Several people mentioned how much Linda had struggled after giving up her baby, and how Margaret had been so helpful during that difficult time. One woman, Carol, who had been particularly close to both sisters, agreed to meet me for coffee to share more detailed memories. Carol met me at a small cafe in Fremont on Saturday afternoon. She was a kind-looking woman in her 50s with graying hair and laugh lines around her eyes, but her expression grew serious when I explained what I was researching. "Sarah, honey," she said carefully, "I'm not sure how much your mom has told you about that time in Linda's life, but it was incredibly complicated. Are you sure you want to hear all the details?" I assured her that I did, though my heart was racing as I prepared to learn more about the woman who was apparently my biological mother. Carol sighed deeply before beginning her story. "Linda was always the free spirit of the family," she explained. "She was artistic, impulsive, and had a huge heart, but she wasn't always practical about life decisions. When she got pregnant at 25, she was dating a man who disappeared the moment he found out about the baby. Linda was working part-time at an art gallery and had no savings, no stable housing, and no support system except for Margaret." Carol paused to take a sip of her latte before continuing. Margaret had been trying to get pregnant for years at that point. She and Robert had gone through fertility treatments, miscarriages, and disappointments. When Linda found out she was pregnant, Margaret saw it as the answer to both of their problems. She convinced Linda that the baby would have a better life with parents who were financially stable, married, and ready to provide everything a child would need. But what happened after Linda gave up the baby? I asked, though I was dreading the answer. Carol's eyes filled with sadness. Linda immediately regretted her decision, but the adoption papers had already been finalized. Margaret convinced her that it would be too confusing and disruptive to maintain a relationship with you, so Linda was essentially cut off from her own child. She spiraled into depression almost immediately. She started drinking heavily, then moved on to harder drugs. Every time she tried to get clean and rebuild her life, she'd remember that she had a daughter she couldn't see or hold, and she'd relapse. The pieces were finally coming together, and I felt sick understanding my parents' role in this tragedy. They hadn't just adopted me, they had orchestrated a situation that separated a mother from her child, and then prevented any relationship that might have helped Linda heal. Margaret tried to help her get into rehab programs. Carol continued, but Linda couldn't forgive herself for giving you up, and she couldn't forgive Margaret for convincing her to do it. The sisters barely spoke during the last 2 years of Linda's life. When Linda overdosed, Margaret was devastated, but she also seemed relieved that the situation was finally resolved. Armed with the truth about my origins and Linda's tragic story, I spent the next week planning my approach. This wasn't just about learning my real history anymore. This was about holding my adoptive parents accountable for the lies they'd built our entire relationship on, and for their role in preventing a relationship between Linda and me that might have saved her life. I decided to confront them during our usual Sunday family dinner, a tradition we'd maintained even after I moved out. I wanted them to feel the same sense of security and normalcy that I'd felt before my world was shattered, and then experience that foundation crumbling beneath them just as I had. Sunday evening, I arrived at their house with a carefully prepared strategy. I brought copies of all the documents. I'd found Linda's real death certificate, the adoption papers, and even some photos that Carol had given me, of Linda holding me as a baby. I also brought a small recording device, though I wasn't entirely sure I'd have the courage to use it. Mom had prepared her famous lasagna, and Dad was in an unusually good mood, telling stories about his latest client's ridiculous accounting methods. For about 30 minutes, we maintained the comfortable family dynamic we'd shared for 26 years. I found myself memorizing small details, the way Mom laughed at Dad's jokes, how Dad insisted on serving everyone before sitting down himself, the familiar comfort of being in the dining room, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, and ordinary moments for as long as I could remember. But then I took a deep breath and changed everything. I need to ask you both about something, I began, placing my fork down and looking directly at both of them. Last Tuesday, when I came by to get my presentation folder, I overheard you talking about Linda. I heard you discussing the fact that Linda was my biological mother, not my aunt. The change in the room was immediate and dramatic. Mom's face went completely white, and Dad's fork clattered against his plate as it fell from his suddenly nerveless fingers. They looked at each other with expressions of panic and guilt that confirmed everything I'd learned. Sarah, sweetheart, Mom began, her voice shaking. You don't understand the whole situation. Actually, I think I understand it perfectly. I interrupted, pulling out the documents I'd brought. I've spent the past week researching everything. I know Linda didn't die in a car accident. I know she died from a drug overdose 3 years after you convinced her to give up her parental rights to me. I know she spiraled into depression and addiction because she regretted giving me up and because you prevented her from having any relationship with me. Dad cleared his throat and attempted to take control of the conversation. Sarah, we did what we thought was best for everyone involved. Linda wasn't in a position to raise a child, and you manipulated a vulnerable woman into giving up her baby, I said, my voice growing stronger as my anger built. And then you cut her off from her own daughter because it was more convenient for you to pretend she never existed. You let me grow up believing my real mother was dead, and you let Linda die believing her daughter was better off without her. Mom began crying, but her tears only made me angrier. We loved you so much, Sarah. We gave you everything we could. We were good parents to you. Good parents don't build their family on lies and manipulation, I replied coldly. Good parents don't destroy someone else's life to get what they want. And good parents definitely don't spend 26 years lying to their child about who she really is. I pulled out the photos Carol had given me, pictures of Linda holding me as a newborn, looking tired but radiantly happy. Did you know that Linda used to visit the park across from my elementary school, just to catch glimpses of me playing at recess? Carol told me that. Linda would sit on a bench and watch her own daughter from a distance, because you convinced her that was the best she could hope for. The look of shock on both their faces told me this was news to them, but it only reinforced my growing determination to make sure they faced real consequences for their actions. Here's what's going to happen, I continued, standing up from the table. I'm going to give you both exactly 24 hours to decide how you want to handle this situation. You can either voluntarily tell the truth to our entire extended family about what really happened to Linda and how you've been lying to me my whole life, or I'll tell the story myself. And trust me, my version is going to include every ugly detail about how you manipulated Linda and then abandoned her when she needed help. Dad attempted one more defense. Sarah, we can't change the past, but we can. You're right, I agreed. You can't change the past. Linda is dead, and I'll never have the chance to know my real mother because of choices you made. But you can stop lying, and you can face the consequences of those choices. 24 hours. I left their house that evening, knowing I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The comfortable family relationship we'd maintained for 26 years was over, but I felt a sense of clarity and purpose I'd never experienced before. Linda deserved to have her story told truthfully, and I deserved to live my life based on reality rather than the carefully constructed fiction my adoptive parents had created. That night, I couldn't sleep, but it wasn't from anxiety or regret. Instead, I felt energized by the prospect of finally honoring my biological mother's memory and making sure that my adoptive parents could never again pretend that their actions hadn't had devastating consequences. The game had changed, and for the first time in this situation, I was the one in control. If you're still with me on this incredible journey of family secrets and justice, you know we're just getting to the good part. The confrontation was just the beginning. Wait until you hear how the rest of my family reacted to learning the truth. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens when decades of lies finally come crashing down. The 24 hours I'd given my adoptive parents felt like the longest day of my life, but also the most empowering. I spent Monday morning at work actually focusing on my job for the first time since the discovery, feeling like I finally had control over my own narrative. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. Please come over tonight. We need to talk as a family. I arrived at their house that evening to find both parents sitting in the living room, looking like they'd aged years in a single day. Dad's usually perfectly combed hair was disheveled, and Mom's eyes were red and swollen from crying. They had clearly spent the day grappling with the reality that their carefully guarded secret was about to be exposed. We've decided to tell the family ourselves, Mom said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Well, call everyone and explain the situation. But Sarah, we need you to understand that we never meant for Linda to get hurt. We genuinely believed we were helping both her and you. Your intentions don't change the outcome. I replied firmly, Linda is dead, and I grew up not knowing my real mother. Those are facts that no amount of good intentions can undo. Dad leaned forward in his chair, looking desperate. What do you want from us, Sarah? How can we make this right? I had spent considerable time thinking about this exact question. I want you to call every single family member, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and tell them the truth about Linda. I want you to admit that you lied about how she died and that you manipulated her into giving me up. And I want you to acknowledge that your actions contributed to her death. Mom's face crumpled. Sarah, that will destroy our relationships with everyone in the family. They'll never look at us the same way again. Good, I said without hesitation. Because you shouldn't be looked at the same way. You should be held accountable for what you did to Linda and to me. Over the next week, my adoptive parents began making the promised phone calls. I insisted on being present for several of them, wanting to ensure they told the complete truth rather than a sanitized version that minimized their role in the tragedy. The reactions from family members were exactly what I had hoped for: shock, disappointment, and anger at the decades of deception. My grandmother, Mom's mother, was particularly devastated. During a tearful phone call, she revealed that she had always suspected something wasn't right about Linda's supposed car accident, especially since no one could ever provide details about where or when it had occurred. I should have pushed harder for answers, she said through her tears. My poor Linda died thinking her family had abandoned her. Uncle Mike, Dad's brother, was furious. You let us all believe that Linda died tragically, and we spent years feeling sorry for you for losing your sister, he said during a tense family meeting. Meanwhile, you were the ones responsible for destroying her life. How could you live with yourselves? The most satisfying reaction came from Carol, who had remained close to several family members over the years. When she learned that the truth was finally coming out, she decided to share additional details that painted an even clearer picture of my adoptive parents' manipulation. Margaret didn't just convince Linda to give up the baby. Carol told a gathering of extended family members. She actively worked to isolate Linda from anyone who might have encouraged her to keep Sarah. Margaret told Linda's friends that Linda needed space to make this difficult decision, and she convinced Linda that seeking support from others would be selfish, because it might influence her to make the wrong choice. These revelations added another layer to the story that I hadn't fully understood. My adoptive parents hadn't just taken advantage of Linda's vulnerable situation, they had systematically eliminated her support system to ensure she felt she had no choice but to give me up. The extended family's reaction was swift and decisive. Within 2 weeks, my adoptive parents found themselves essentially ostracized from family gatherings and celebrations. Invitations to birthday parties, holiday dinners, and casual get-togethers suddenly stopped coming. When they did attend family events, conversations became stilted and uncomfortable, with people clearly struggling to reconcile the people they thought they knew with the manipulative individuals who had orchestrated Linda's tragedy. The most powerful moment came when my grandmother decided to create a memorial for Linda that acknowledged her as my biological mother. She organized a small ceremony at Linda's gravesite, where family members shared memories and stories that painted a picture of a loving, creative woman who had been failed by the people she trusted most. Standing at Linda's grave for the first time, seeing her real name and dates on the headstone, I finally felt connected to my biological mother, in a way that 26 years of lies had never allowed. I brought flowers and a letter I'd written, telling her about my life and apologizing for not knowing the truth sooner. "I promise, make sure your story is told honestly," I whispered to her grave, "and I promise that the people who hurt you will face the consequences of their choices." As word spread through our broader community, my adoptive parents began facing consequences beyond just family disapproval. Mom worked at a children's hospital, where several colleagues knew about her supposed fertility struggles and her miraculous adoption of her sister's baby after Linda's tragic accident. When the truth came out, her reputation at work suffered significantly, with coworkers questioning her integrity and judgment. Dad's accounting clients, many of whom had known for years and had shared personal stories with, began questioning whether they could trust someone who had built his family life on such elaborate deceptions. Several long-term clients quietly moved their business elsewhere, not wanting to associate with someone who had manipulated a vulnerable woman and then lied about the consequences for decades. The social consequences were perhaps the most devastating for them. In their close-knit neighborhood, where they had been respected community members for over 20 years, they suddenly found themselves the subject of whispered conversations and judgmental looks. Neighbors who had known them as loving parents and pillars of the community now saw them as people capable of profound manipulation and deception. As the family drama continued to unfold, I decided to dig even deeper into Linda's story. I contacted the rehab facilities where she had attempted to get clean, spoke with former coworkers from the art gallery, and even tracked down her old landlords. What I discovered painted an even more heartbreaking picture of a woman who had been systematically isolated and manipulated by the very people who should have supported her. Linda's former supervisor at the art gallery, Marcus, agreed to meet with me and shared details that made my blood boil with renewed anger. Linda was incredibly talented, he told me over coffee. She had real artistic vision and was starting to build a reputation in the local art scene. But after she gave up her baby, she couldn't focus on anything. She'd come to work and just stare at paintings of mothers with children, tears streaming down her face. Marcus revealed that Linda had tried multiple times to get information about me, my health, my development, whether I was happy. She would call your mother regularly, begging for updates or photos. But Margaret would always tell her that contact would be confusing for you and unfair to everyone involved. Linda started drinking heavily because it was the only way she could get through the day without thinking about the daughter she couldn't see. Even more damaging was what I learned from Dr. Patricia Wells, a therapist who had worked with Linda during one of her attempts at recovery. Dr. Wells, now retired, agreed to speak with me after I explained the situation. Linda was one of the most genuinely loving people I ever worked with, Dr. Wells told me during a phone conversation. But she was also one of the most guilt-ridden. She carried tremendous shame about giving up her child, and that shame was constantly reinforced by your adoptive mother, who would call Linda periodically to remind her that seeking contact would be selfish and potentially harmful to you. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my adoptive parents prevented Linda from having a relationship with me, but they had actively used psychological manipulation to ensure she felt too guilty to even try. Did Linda ever express regret about the adoption? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Every single session. Dr. Wells replied sadly. She would say that giving up her baby was the biggest mistake of her life, and that she would do anything to have the chance to be your mother again. But Margaret had convinced her that you were thriving, and that any disruption to your life would be cruel and selfish. Armed with this new information, I decided to confront my adoptive parents one final time. I wanted them to understand the full scope of their actions, and to acknowledge the psychological torture they had inflicted on Linda, even after she had given me up. I arrived at their house unannounced on a Saturday morning, finding them in their kitchen having breakfast and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy, despite their rapidly crumbling social lives. "I've been talking to people who knew Linda after she gave me up," I announced without preamble. "I know about the phone calls where you made her feel guilty for wanting updates about me. I know you told her that any contact would be harmful to me. And I know that you actively prevented her from getting the help she needed by convincing her that she didn't deserve to recover because she had abandoned her child." The look of panic that crossed both their faces told me everything I needed to know. These weren't just people who had made a questionable decision 26 years ago. They were people who had systematically tortured a vulnerable woman for years to protect their own interests. "Sarah, you have to understand," Mom began desperately. "We were protecting you. You were protecting yourselves." I cut her off. "You were terrified that if Linda got clean and stable, she might want me back, and you couldn't risk losing the child you'd manipulated her into giving you." I pulled out my phone and placed it on the kitchen table. "I'm going to record what you're about to tell me, and then I'm going to share that recording with everyone who needs to hear it. You're going to admit, on the record, that you psychologically manipulated Linda even after the adoption, that you prevented her from getting help, and that your actions directly contributed to her death." Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Sarah, this has gone far enough. We won't be threatened or blackmailed by our own daughter." "Then you've made your choice," I replied calmly. "But just so you know, I've already spoken with a journalist from the Seattle Times who is interested in writing a story about adoption, manipulation, and the long-term consequences for birth parents. I can either give her a story about parents who eventually took responsibility for their actions, or I can give her a story about parents who refused to acknowledge their role in a young woman's death even when confronted with overwhelming evidence." The threat of public exposure beyond our family and social circles was clearly something they hadn't considered. Mom began crying again, but this time her tears seemed to come from genuine fear rather than guilt or sadness. "What do you want us to say?" she whispered. I started the recording on my phone and looked directly at both of them. "I want you to tell the truth about what you did to Linda, and I want you to acknowledge that your actions killed her, as surely as if you had given her the drugs yourself." What followed was a 30-minute confession that exceeded even my expectations. Under the pressure of potential public exposure, my adoptive parents admitted to levels of manipulation and psychological abuse that shocked even me. They revealed that they had not only prevented Linda from having contact with me, but had also sabotaged her attempts to maintain relationships with friends who might have supported her recovery. Most damning of all, they admitted that Linda had contacted them just weeks before her death, begging to see me just once, and they had refused, telling her that I was better off thinking she was dead. The recording I obtained that day became the catalyst for consequences I had never imagined possible. After consulting with several lawyers, I learned that while my adoptive parents couldn't be prosecuted criminally for their manipulation of Linda, their actions had potential civil implications, particularly regarding fraud in the adoption process and intentional infliction of emotional distress. More importantly, the recording provided the evidence needed to ensure that Linda's story would be told with complete honesty. I shared it with the extended family, with Linda's former friends, and ultimately with the Seattle Times journalist, who had expressed interest in the story. The newspaper article, titled, "When Adoption Becomes Manipulation: A Seattle Family's Decades-Long Deception," was published 3 months after my initial discovery. It detailed Linda's story with compassion and accuracy, painting a picture of a young woman who had been systematically destroyed by people she trusted. The article also highlighted broader issues about adoption practices and the need for better protections for birth parents who might be vulnerable to manipulation. The public response to the article was overwhelming. Dozens of people came forward with similar stories of adoptions where birth parents had been manipulated or coerced. A local adoption advocacy group reached out to me about testifying before state legislators about the need for reform in adoption oversight and birth parent protection. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from people who had known Linda. Artists, gallery owners, former coworkers, and friends reached out to share memories and express gratitude that her real story was finally being told. A local art gallery even organized a memorial exhibition featuring Linda's work, with proceeds going to support programs for birth parents struggling with addiction and depression. My adoptive parents, meanwhile, faced consequences that extended far beyond family disapproval. The newspaper article led to scrutiny of Dad's accounting practice, and several business organizations he belonged to quietly asked him to resign. Mom faced an ethics investigation at the hospital where she worked, though ultimately she was allowed to keep her job with a formal reprimand in her file. Their social isolation became complete when neighbors and community members read the article and realized they had been living next to people capable of such sustained manipulation and deception. The house where I had grown up, once a center of neighborhood social activity, became a place people crossed the street to avoid. 6 months after my initial discovery, I made the decision to legally change my last name from Mitchell to Morrison, Linda's surname. It felt like the final step in reclaiming my identity and honoring my biological mother's memory. The day I received my new driver's license with Sarah Morrison printed on it, I felt a sense of completeness I had never experienced as Sarah Mitchell. I also decided to take a leave of absence from my job to focus on advocacy work for birth parent rights. The promotion I had once desperately wanted seemed insignificant compared to the opportunity to ensure that other vulnerable parents wouldn't face the manipulation that Linda had endured. My adoptive parents made several attempts to reconcile with me over the following months, but I maintained firm boundaries. I was willing to have limited contact regarding practical matters, but the parent-child relationship we had once shared was permanently severed. They had lost the right to be called my parents the moment they chose to prioritize their own desires over Linda's well-being and my right to know the truth. The most healing part of this entire journey was connecting with other people who had known and loved Linda. Through them, I was able to piece together a picture of my biological mother as a kind, creative, passionate woman who had been failed by the system and by the people who should have protected her. I learned about her love of photography, her talent for painting landscapes, and her dream of opening her own gallery someday. I also discovered that Linda had kept a journal during her pregnancy with me, which her former roommate had saved after her death. Reading her words about her hopes for my future, her love for me even before I was born, and her agonizing decision to give me up, brought both heartbreak and healing. In those pages, I finally got to meet my real mother and understand the depth of her love for me. 1 year after that fateful Tuesday morning when I forgot my presentation folder, I stood again at Linda's gravesite. This time, I wasn't alone. Carol was there, along with several of Linda's former friends, and even my grandmother, who had become one of my strongest allies in ensuring Linda's memory was honored truthfully. As we shared stories and memories, I realized that while I couldn't change the past or bring Linda back, I had succeeded in ensuring that her story would be remembered accurately, and that the people responsible for her tragedy had faced real consequences for their actions. Have you ever discovered a family secret that completely changed how you saw your relatives? How do you think you would handle learning that your entire life had been built on a lie? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful stories come from people who've walked similar paths of family betrayal and justice. If this story of uncovering family secrets and fighting for truth resonated with you, please give it a like to help others find it. Subscribe for more real-life stories about family drama, justice, and the power of speaking truth to those who've wronged us. And don't forget to share this with anyone who might need to hear that it's never too late to fight for justice, even when it means challenging the people who raised you. From my family's painful journey through deception to justice, I've learned that sometimes the people who claim to love us most are capable of the deepest betrayal, but I've also learned that truth has a power that can overcome decades of lies. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and remember, you deserve to know your real story, no matter how uncomfortable it might make other people. Here's to living authentically, honoring those who've been silenced, and never letting manipulative people escape the consequences of their choices.